Welcome to the Wednesday Bible Study, February the 1st of 2023. So glad you're tuning in. I know I say that every week, and it's not just a repetitive statement. It's true. I'm glad that you're tuning in, and we at Union Hill are glad that we can make this provision of Bible study available for you. And as we've been studying thus far in 2023, the book of Acts. So you might want to open your Bibles to Acts chapter 2. We're going to pick up where we left off last week. And while you're turning there, let me invite you to our in-person Wednesday Bible study every Wednesday night at 7 o'clock. On Sundays, the Lord's Day, we have 3 occasions of assembling together. We meet for a Bible class every Sunday morning at 10 a.m. Our adult class or auditorium class is focused on the minor prophets right now, so we're looking into the Old Testament. I know there have been those who have claimed that the Church of Christ doesn't believe in the Old Testament. And the reason that claim comes out is because some think that because we do not use mechanical instruments of music, that we don't believe in the Old Testament, because that's where they find their justification for the use of mechanical instruments. We believe in the Old Testament, but we believe that we're not under the old law because the New Testament so claims it. And that's what we're looking at even here in Acts chapter 2. But we do study the Old Testament because there are great principles to understand, and the Bible is one complete book from Genesis to Revelation. And so in that Sunday morning Bible class, we are now looking into the writings of the minor prophets. We're in the book of Hosea as we currently speak. And so we'd love to have you come and be a part of that. We do live stream that Bible class, so you can find it on Facebook as well. And then at 11 a.m. we meet for a worship assembly. We come together as the church to worship God by the avenue of worship that He has laid out in His scriptures. And so we would love to have you come and be with us for that worship assembly as we engage in the 5 acts of worship. And then on Sunday evenings at 6 p.m. we assemble for an evening period of worship as well. And then the last Sunday of each month, that evening worship is at 2 p.m. instead of 6 p.m. But every Lord's Day, we assemble together for that period of worship. And so we'd love to have you come and be with us. Let's get into Acts chapter 2. We've already looked at the first 13 verses particularly. Remember Acts 2, we divided it into 4 parts. The first part dealt with the outpouring of the Spirit in the first 13 verses. And then with verse 14, you begin the segment dealing with Peter's response to the mocking as well as the answer to the question, what meaneth this? Because with the outpouring of the Spirit, there was that which was heard and there was that which was seen. And so the people ask, what meaneth this? And Peter answers that question from verse 13 to verse 21. And then he speaks to the reason that men ought to call upon the name of the Lord, as we're going to get into today. And then as you look past Peter's preaching ending at verse 36, you'll see the immediate reaction to the events in the preaching of Peter in verse 37 through 40. And then you'll see the subsequent result in verse 41 through 47. After that initial reaction, you have the response of 3,000 people, and then you have the continuing of that group after these events of that day. So that's chapter 2 laid out. We discussed those first 13 verses last week. We understood what Pentecost was about and the significance of that day, especially this particular Pentecost. We looked at the outpouring of the Spirit and what that meant. And now we are examining, after the response of the people to that outpouring, we are examining Peter's words. And of course, initially, Peter's response is, beginning in verse 14, that what is being seen and heard, what is taking place on that day, is the fulfillment of the prophecy of Joel. So whatever is transpiring here, understand it's what Joel, 750, 800 years prior, had actually talked about. And it was the pouring out of the Spirit upon all flesh. And what we've looked at thus far in that is the fact that Joel says it would happen in the last days. And so we emphasized last week what the last days meant. Or in our last Bible study together in the book of Acts, we studied what those last days meant. And what it meant, just in a nutshell, without rehashing what we already talked about last week, was that God has dealt with man in three different law systems: the patriarchal law system, the law of Moses, and now the law of Christ. And this last dispensation is that of the Messiah's reign, the reign of King Jesus. And so the last days have begun. If Joel prophesied that these events would happen in the last days, and Peter says it is happening there on that Pentecost after the resurrection and ascension of Jesus, then the last days had commenced. They had begun. And we are currently living in the last times, or the last days. And that was significant because this is it. This is the finality. This is the Christian dispensation. Now, we have a few other things we want to mention before we get into Peter's sermon proper. Notice here, picking up where we left off last week, that in verse 17, beyond "this is that which was spoken by the prophet Joel," he actually quotes or reiterates what Joel had actually said. And it says, "It shall come to pass in the last days, saith God, I will pour out my Spirit upon all flesh." Now we know what the pouring out of the Spirit meant, as we looked in verse 1 through 4, with that idea of the baptism of the Holy Spirit. And so what do we mean here by the all flesh, or as the Spirit was poured out, the baptismal measure of the Holy Spirit applied to the apostles as Jesus said it would be, and then the effects of that, or the results of that, going forward from that point? Well, God poured out his Spirit, and we do need to address this matter of all flesh. What does it mean that he would pour out his Spirit upon all flesh? And we have to understand the concept here of flesh and all that flesh that he's talking about. Obviously, he's not talking in the sense of literally every type of flesh. You know, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, the Apostle Paul in verse number 39 talked about there being four types of flesh. There's the flesh of birds, there is the flesh of fish, there is the flesh of beasts, and there is the flesh of humanity, or of human beings. And obviously the Spirit was not poured out upon fish flesh, bird flesh, and animal flesh. We would narrow it down, this flesh that he's talking about, to the flesh of humanity. But even then, there's a stricter sense of the terminology, upon all flesh. We know that some flesh is evil. So we're not literally speaking of every type of flesh, as Paul talked about in 1 Corinthians 15:39. We're also not talking about every human flesh, or all human flesh, because some human flesh is wicked. Some is evil. Some utilize their times in the pursuits of the flesh, in the pursuit of wickedness, in satisfying and fulfilling their vain imaginations and their wicked imaginations. And obviously, it wasn't poured out upon that flesh. So what are we really talking about with all flesh? Well, consider who is speaking here and what he's speaking about, and the subsequent fulfillment of these things in the pouring out of all flesh. What we're actually looking at here is the two distinct groups of individuals in the world. There are the Jews, to whom Peter is speaking on that day, the Israelite nation, and there is all other flesh, or the Gentile flesh. And that accords with the book of Acts, because here in Acts 2, he is going to focus his attention to the Israelites, to the Jew first. And then, as Paul said in Romans chapter 1 and verse 16, the gospel was for the Jew first, and also to the Greek, or to the Gentile. When you come to Acts chapter 10, you'll note the pouring out of the Spirit as it relates to the Gentile world. So when you look at the idea here, meaning not to the Jews only, but also to the Gentile, that's all flesh, because all humanity was covered under the concept of Jew and Gentile. And remember, even in Galatians chapter 3, he would speak of how salvation is in Christ. We're baptized into Christ. We put on Christ. And it's not just to the Jew, but he says Jew and Gentile, or circumcision and uncircumcision. That was another way of classifying the human flesh. Those who were submissive to that circumcision law that was part of the covenant made with Abraham, but that was a condition given to the Israelites, and the Greeks didn't practice it. The Gentiles didn't practice circumcision as a token of the law, and so circumcision and uncircumcision was another way of signifying Jew and Gentile. And so the pouring out of the Spirit upon all flesh was the accessibility of the Spirit, the accessibility of the effects of the Spirit, or the availability of the blessings that would pour forth from the Spirit to both Jew and Gentile. So we know who the all flesh here is, the pouring out upon all flesh. And you also understand that the apostles, having been baptized with the Holy Spirit, as it would later be seen in passages like chapter 8, when Philip was down in Samaria and he converted those of the Samaritans, and then Peter and John went down there and laid hands on them so that they would receive the Spirit, or would receive a miraculous gift of the Spirit. Even in Acts chapter 6, you're going to notice that when those 7 were selected from among the group to take care of the Grecian widows, the apostles laid hands on them. And you'll then notice that Stephen, among that 7, began to preach, and he utilized miracles and signs and wonders, or miracles, wonders, and signs. And thus Philip did as well, being also one of those 6. So the laying on of the apostles' hands would make this available as they laid their hands on people. These miraculous measure, this miraculous power would be departed or distributed unto other individuals. And that would also then occur with the Gentiles. So through the apostles' hands, miraculous measure would be imparted. Notice here also he says that in verse number 17, upon all flesh, number 1, then he says, your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams, and on my servants and on my handmaids I will pour out in those days of my Spirit, and they shall prophesy. Notice all of those distinctions that he makes. All flesh, as we said, is a reference to Jew and Gentile. The sons and daughters becomes a reference to male and female. You have the old men and young men, a reference to age. And then you have servants and handmaidens as a reference to social position, or that distinction of social standing. You had those that were free, and you had those that were servants or handmaids, those that, for lack of a better term, were slaves under the Roman system. And so when this Spirit was poured out, it would be poured out without distinction of Jew and Gentile. It will be poured out without distinction of gender. It would be poured out without distinction of age. And it would be poured out without distinction of social position. Thus, in the kingdom of our Lord, in the kingdom of Christ, there would not be those distinctions. The blessings and the privileges of the kingdom would be afforded to all. And the Spirit would be so poured out. So now we know what all flesh meant. Dealing with humanity, but particular Jew and Gentile. And then as you break that down, without distinction of gender, without distinction of age, without distinction of social position. Thus all flesh. Now, we also have this in verse number 19, after the Spirit is poured out, and you see that we're dealing with miraculous measure here of this. How would those sons and daughters begin to prophesy, or be able to prophesy? The young men, through the laying on of the apostles' hands, as we're later given that knowledge in the book of Acts itself. And then you notice it says, I will show wonders in heaven above, signs in the earth beneath, blood and fire and vapor of smoke. The sun shall be turned into darkness, and the moon into blood before the great and notable day of the Lord. So we have some explaining to do here. What do we mean by these showing of wonders in heaven above and signs in the earth beneath? Well, wonders and signs are put together. We have these amazing things, these marvelous things that are going to create wonderment and amazement, but they're going to signify something. We're going to talk more about wonders and signs in a few moments. But what we're talking about here with the blood, fire, vapor of smoke, and the sun being turned to darkness and the moon into blood, we're talking about signs. And notice that these signs are going to occur before the great and notable day of the Lord. So our question is actually going to come down to, what is this great and notable day of the Lord? Now, when we look at that, the great and notable day of the Lord, it's a reference to a terrible day in Joel. If you look at Joel's actual wording in Joel 2, the great and terrible day of the Lord, we certainly have a day of the Lord's coming. But what are we signifying? Now, there would be those that would offer the supposition that what we're looking at is the day of Pentecost. Some would say, well, this is the day of Pentecost that's under consideration. The great and notable day of the Lord coming is a reference to Pentecost, according to some. Well, it's possible. You do have some signs that came before. If you looked at Matthew chapter 27 with the crucifixion of Jesus, when he gives up the ghost, in verse 51 through 54, there were certain miraculous events that happened. The tombs were empty and the dead were raised. The veil in the temple was rent and so forth. Even at the death of Jesus, the sun was darkened in the brightest part of the day. Darkness covered the face of the earth at the death of Jesus. So some would say those are the signs that he's talking about here. We're not necessarily literally looking at blood and fire and vapor of smoke, but rather just ways of depicting signage, signs, indications that something was going to happen, and then Pentecost would be that notable day. If it's Pentecost, signs did precede it. Some would say it's the destruction of Jerusalem, and according to Matthew 24, verse 29, there would be a sign. There would be things that preceded the destruction of Jerusalem, and then there would be the specific sign of the abomination of desolation that would indicate, and he does depict it as the coming of the Lord, a destruction declared by God. Thus it was God's doing, even though it was the Roman general Titus that actually carried out that destruction. He was, in essence, an agent of the Lord, carrying out that destruction for the disbelief and the rejection of the Jews of God's Messiah. So we would say certainly the signs could fit. Malachi chapter 4, verse 1 through 3 spoke of that, of certain signs. But let's focus it even more so. Most likely we're looking at the final coming or the final judgment, because when Jesus comes again, there'll be a final judgment. And it is my understanding and my conviction that this great and notable day of the Lord is a reference to that final coming of Jesus. And these things that would happen would happen before the coming of Jesus, not though as signs of his final coming, because that will happen as a thief in the night. But these are things that relate to the pouring out of the Spirit and the happenings regarding the Spirit, those miraculous things. Keep in mind that these signs that he talks about, the blood, fire, vapor of smoke, and the sun being darkened, and the moon being turned to blood, were actually Old Testament language that was a way of depicting judgment occurring. In Ezekiel chapter 30 and verse 3, or Ezekiel 23 verse 7 and 8, or Isaiah 19 and verse 1, or Isaiah 13 verse 1, and then verse 9 and 10, Amos chapter 5 and verse 18. We're not taking time to read all of those, but you could go back and look those up and take like Isaiah 19 or Isaiah 13. I believe it's Isaiah 13 that's a reference either to Egypt or Babylon. I don't remember right off the top of my head. I didn't write it down on my little notepad here. But those were terms that were used for the destruction of these nations around Israel, and sometimes used for Israel, the northern kingdom, or the southern kingdom of Judah, as a pronouncement of a judgment against them, a destruction that was going to come. And so as you think about those signs as a sign of judgment, you have to realize that what is happening on this Pentecost with the pouring out of the Spirit is actually a going forward of the judgments of Jesus. There is a judgment that is taking place on this day. Just like at Mount Sinai in Exodus chapter 19 and 20, and then into chapter 21. You remember when the Lord came down upon Sinai, God descended, all the people were told to wash themselves and be ready, assemble at the base of the mountain, but don't touch the mountain. When God came down upon the mountain to meet Moses and to speak to the people regarding the giving of the law, and he gave forth in thunderings from Mount Sinai, they saw great and terrible things on the top of that mountain as the Lord had descended, and the thunderings and the lightnings, and it was such a display that after those 10 commandments were uttered by God to the people and etched in those tables of stone, the people said, Moses, go up and talk to the Lord yourself. And in Exodus 21 and verse 1, when Moses did that, he said, these are the judgments of the Lord. The sounding forth of the law, or the giving forth of the law, is depicted as these are God's judgments. And that's actually what's happening here on the day of Pentecost, that the judgments of the Lord, aka the law of Christ, is going forward. There was going to be a pronouncement. When you come to verse 21 and he talks about calling on the name of the Lord shall be saved, what is about to transpire is a giving forth of the means by which one calls upon the name of the Lord for salvation. You're actually going to have given forth the laws of Christ. And remember, Isaiah chapter 2 talked about the word of the Lord and the law of God going forth from Jerusalem and from Zion. That's what is beginning to happen on this day. And all of that would transpire before the Lord would come again. And of course, it happened. And so the judgment here, the great and terrible day of the Lord coming, is a reference to that final judgment. The law of Christ was going to go forward. It would, as he would reign from the right hand of God on high, he would reign from heaven. His law would govern us, and then he will come again to judge. So it is my understanding here that the great and notable, or the great and terrible day of the Lord, a reference to the final judgment, is going to be preceded, as it was on the day of Pentecost and in that first century, by those miracles, signs, and wonders that were done by the power of the Holy Spirit, as the judgment of Christ went forward, which we now have in the New Testament, in the law of Christ, for us to read and discern and actually implement in our lives so as to be prepared for that great and notable day of the Lord coming. And so that's my understanding of the great and notable day. Now, one other thing that we'll mention here, it shall come to pass. Now, this pouring out of the Spirit is going to happen. And why is that going to happen? Well, because it shall come to pass that whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. And this is the ultimate purpose of these events. What is transpiring on Pentecost is going to ultimately bring about, or is going to point out, the terms and conditions of salvation. How is it that one is going to be saved? Well, these events, the events of this day, were ultimately going to establish those terms of salvation, the calling on the name of the Lord. Peter's sermon is actually going to present the reason why we would need to call upon the name of the Lord, why it is that his name, his authority needs to be called upon. And then in answering the question of the people in verse 37, what shall we do? He is going to tell them how to call upon the name of the Lord. So as he makes the statement here, whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved, whatever he says from at this juncture is forever going to settle the question about what it means to call upon the name of the Lord. There will be no doubt as we read down through this. Now, we're not going to explain that right now. As we study chapter 2, we're going to come back, after we study these events, we're going to come back to explain precisely what it means to call upon the name of the Lord. Suffice it here to say, whatever is going to be presented is actually going to be forever the terms by which one would be saved, by which one would enter the kingdom. Because remember, this was going to be for all flesh, no matter the gender, no matter the age, no matter the social position, whether Jew or Gentile, no matter how young or old, no matter how they fit into the stratosphere of societal norms, and no matter their gender, they would all have the same terms by which to be saved, that is, in calling upon the name of the Lord. So, let's, at this juncture, just examine the rest of the text. Let's see this laid out before us in the text, and then come back and say, well, what then did it mean to call upon the name of the Lord? Because the text is actually going to answer that question. So let's get into Peter's explanation here. Because you notice at verse 22, he actually transitions now into that question of why call upon the name of the Lord. He had just told them what they're going to need to do. Now he's going to tell them why they need to do it. And then he'll follow that up by telling them what to do. But he says, ye men of Israel, hear these words. And in hearing these words, they're going to focus on Jesus, this Jesus of Nazareth. And the Jesus of Nazareth here is only going to separate him from anyone else by that name. Now, you and I may look at this and say, well, in our culture and day, we pretty much know who you're talking about when you mention the name of Jesus. But keep in mind, he is talking to a group of Israelites that are assembled together in Jerusalem. And in that crowd, what you have here is a very common name, a name that references the salvation of the Lord. In the Old Testament, it was the name Joshua. And among Israelites, the name Joshua, or the Greek equivalent, as it's transliterated into English, Jesus, would be a common name, just like Ibrahim would have been, or Abraham, or Joseph, or even John. All of those names were quite common. And so when you look at the name Jesus here, Peter is signifying the particular Jesus under consideration, that Jesus of Nazareth. And of course, that would bring their attention exactly to who they were now going to be discussing. But the whole message is going to focus on him and why calling upon his name is going to lead to salvation. And let me just say at the outset here, we're actually going to look at Peter's words here, Peter's sermon, in three parts, because he has basically a three-part sermon. The first thing he's going to discuss is the determinate counsel of God. In verse 22 through verse number 24, he's going to focus on the message of the gospel. And he's going to focus on Jesus in his life, in his death, and in his resurrection. And so in the first part, you need to call upon him because it pertains to the determinate counsel of God. This is God's doing. That's what he's going to focus on in that first part. Number two, he's going to focus on him being the fulfillment of prophecy. Now, it's going to be related to the resurrection of Jesus, but he is going to utilize the words of David to demonstrate that this resurrection of Jesus was something that was always anticipated and understood to happen. And so he's the fulfillment of prophecy. And then he's going to talk about the consequences of that resurrection from the dead in the third part, in verse 33 through verse 36. So all of this is going to build to this grand conclusion of verse 36, therefore let all the house of Israel know assuredly. And by the time he's done, he's going to have laid down the argumentation as to why you need to call upon Jesus in order to be saved. Of course, not yet answering how we actually do that. So don't make supposition here. Don't suppose the answer at this juncture without actually looking into what Peter is going to tell them is the answer to that question, how you call upon his name. So let's look at the first section of this sermon in verse 22 through 24, when he says, "Ye men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man approved of God among you by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did by him in the midst of you, as ye yourselves also know. Him being delivered by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God, ye have taken, and by wicked hands have crucified and slain, whom God hath raised up, having loosed the pains of death, because it was not possible that he should be holden of it." Now, consider what is said here in a contrasting proposition. God's disposition or attitude toward Jesus versus that audience, that group of Israelites that was assembled, and what they did just 50 days, well, a little over 50 days prior regarding this Jesus. Jesus was approved among you, number one. This approving means that God accredited him. God not just approved of him in the sense of our usage of the term approval, but God set him forth. God presented him or gave him accreditation to his claims and his teaching that he is from God. And of course, it's the works that he did, the miracles, the signs, and the wonders. And there's a couple of things to consider in this. Number one, those miracles and signs and wonders were evident by that people. Remember what Nicodemus said in John chapter 3? And Nicodemus was one of that Sanhedrin council. He's one of those Jewish leaders. And among those leaders, there were those that believed. He said, no man can do these things except God be with him. And he's focused on the miraculous things that Jesus was doing. They knew that Jesus was doing things that could only be attributable to the power of God. These things weren't getting done if God was not with him. And then, of course, the blind man of John chapter 9, verse 31 and 32, when they tried to get him to disclaim Jesus. He had been healed by the power of Jesus, and they wanted him to renounce Jesus as a sinner. And he said, whether he be a sinner or no, I know not. But here's what I do know. The things that he's doing, an unrighteous man wouldn't be doing. A sinner wouldn't be doing. And so let the evidence speak for itself. That evidence was there for them to see. And so Peter says God approved him. God accredited him. God demonstrated through these miraculous things that Jesus was the Messiah. So God set him forth by those things. Yet you rejected him. You condemned him to death when God had actually accredited him. You received him not as the Messiah. Now, you also think about those miracles that he did as they accredited him. And just quickly thinking about the miracles that he did, first of all, they were instantaneous. They happened immediately. In Matthew chapter 12, when the Pharisees had put before him a man with a withered hand, they had strategically placed this man in front of Jesus. They were trying to conjure up a way to discredit Jesus in the eyes of the people. So he's there, I believe it was on the Sabbath day, and whether or not it was good to heal on the Sabbath day. Well, Jesus in verse number 13 of Matthew 12 told him to put forth his hand, and it was restored whole as the other in a moment, immediately. The man's hand was withered. It was drawn up. It was unusable. But when Jesus said put it forth, as that man attempted to put that withered hand, unusable hand forward, it was immediately healed, and he put it forth, and it was just like the other hand. It was an instantaneous thing. You couldn't deny it because it happened immediately. It wasn't any physical therapy that had to be done. It wasn't some surgical procedure that had to have time to mend and heal. It was immediate in its action. It was also perfect or complete in the same passage. Not only was it immediately done, it was perfectly done. It was restored whole as the other. So in an instantaneous way, it was completely healed. It didn't take time to heal. It didn't have to be built up in its muscle form. It was immediately usable just like the other one was. It was also public. Matthew 12 and verse 9. It wasn't something he did out of the sight of others and then claimed as a miracle. It was there for all to see. Those Pharisees put that man with that withered hand. They knew he had a withered hand. They put him there for everyone to see, even the multitude, to see what Jesus would do on the Sabbath. It was acknowledged by the enemies, Matthew 12, 22 through 24. They couldn't deny that a miracle had been done, so what were they going to do about it? Well, they said he did it by the power of Beelzebub. They didn't deny the miracle. They tried to discredit the source of the power. And of course, in so doing, they were actually blaspheming God. Not one of his miracles failed. There was not one time in which Jesus set to do a miracle that it did not get done. It was also supportive of truth. In John 11 and verse 42, the things that he did signified him to be the source of resurrection and life, as he talked to the sisters of Lazarus, Mary and Martha. And so everything that Jesus did pointed toward or signified the truth of his existence, who he was, and even that which he spoke. Such was the nature of those miracles. And then, of course, you take the third thing about this, the words that are used, miracles, wonders, and sign. The word miracles comes from the Greek dunamis, which is used 120 times in the scriptures. Now, sometimes it's used and translated power, like in Romans 1:16, the power of God unto salvation. But of the 120 times that it's used in the New Testament, 8 times it is translated miracles, and 12 times it is translated mighty works, to signify the miraculous working of God. And it just speaks to the might or the power that was on display, a power that was not possessed of any human being, that was not inherent within a human. It had to be of the Lord, a work that had to be by the power of God. In fact, when you notice that a man approved of God among you by miracles, the instrumental factor. What was the instrument by which God approved or credited Jesus? It was by this miraculous power, this mighty work, because it was something that only God could do. And that's why Nicodemus said, no man can do this thing except God be with him. Then you have the word wonder, which means it's something amazing. It's beyond man's comprehension or understanding. It comes from the Greek word teros, which is used 16 times in the New Testament, but it's always in the plural and it's always connected or in correlation with the term sign. It's never used by itself. None of these miracles were ever done solely to provide or to make a wonderment. It was always for the purpose of connecting it with something meaningful. The word sign, a wonder, was connected with the idea of the sign because it pointed to something. This word Simeon, the Greek Simeon that is translated sign, is used 77 times in the New Testament, and 12 times it is used to translate, or the word miracle is used to translate it. All the other occasions it's used to signify or to translate, or it's translated by the word sign. John was an apostle that was most prolific in using it. It was his favorite term to use relative to the power of the Holy Spirit, or the miraculous power that was on display. And the ultimate purpose then of these miracles was to signify something regarding Jesus and his word. Think about what John said. Truly many other things Jesus did in the presence of his disciples that are not written in this book, but these are written that you might believe. John 20, 30 and 31. They were designed to produce faith in Jesus and in his word. And so God approved him. He accredited him by these miracles, wonders, and signs. clear indications that God was with him, because no other explanation would work. God had to have been the source behind it. They were truly amazing. Men would stand amazed in wonderment or marvel at what was done, and it would be a sign. It would signify something. It would be something meaningful or point out something, and such it is on this day. The things that you're seeing and hearing, Paul said, or Peter says, is for a purpose of confirmation. It's pouring out because the judgments of the Lord are going forward, and what you're seeing and what you're hearing was going to be a clear and precise indication that the thing that was happening was of God, and that God was behind or with these men. And he's going to reference that again in just a little bit within his sermon. So these signs and wonders that were done. Now notice also, he says here in verse number 23, him being delivered by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God. This whole thing regarding Jesus was a fixed purpose in the mind of God. Now, according to 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 2, this was from times eternal. Same thing in verse number 20 regarding Jesus being slain, the lamb slain from the foundation of the world. This was the foreknowledge of God. This was something that God foresaw, God foreknew, God understood would be transpiring before he ever created this world. In the past eternity, when you think about the span of it's hard for me to put it into words exactly what we're talking about. You had eternity. Then you had a point in time, and we say that in as though time has always been, but it's not. You have eternity, no tabulation of time, no sense of time, but then God creates the world, and in so doing, he creates what we know to be time. And of course, the greater light to rule the day, the lesser light to rule the night. God established these 24-hour periods as one day. In the first day of creation, when God said, "Let there be light," and there was light, God had brought order, and part of that order was a 24-hour day that would culminate then into seasons of the year in fall, spring, summer, and winter, and might say spring, summer, fall, and winter, however you want to look at it, but the four seasons. And so there is this concept of time, from seconds to minutes to hours to days to weeks to months to years to decades to centuries and so forth. God created that time, and there's a point at which time will be no more. Time will end, and eternity on that side of time will begin. So this foreknowledge of God reaches back to that eternity before time existed. And in that period of eternity, before God ever formed time, creating this world and established this, what we know as time, had already determined that Jesus was going to die. The determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God. This was God's fixed plan, or God's definite plan that he saw being fulfilled long before it ever happened. So he delivers Jesus to you. He put Jesus in your power. Even Jesus had talked about that, him being delivered. He was delivered into the hands of men. Men would do with him what they would, and then it would be taken back out of their hands. So God delivers him, as he says, ye have taken. God delivered him according to his foreknowledge. He put him in your power. You took him, and by wicked hands have crucified and slain. What did you do with him? Well, the idea of wicked hands here is the idea that he was put into the hands of wicked men to be crucified. And it's a reference to the fact that they delivered him to Pilate. They delivered him into the hands of the Gentiles, who then enacted this means of death that was crucifixion, which God knew long before it happened. In the Old Testament, it even spoke to the matter of how that death would be incurred. And so this whole plan of God was understood long before it ever happened. Acts 3:13 through 15 speaks of it when Peter says there, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and of Jacob, the God of our fathers, hath glorified his son Jesus, whom ye delivered up, and denied him in the presence of Pilate when he was determined to let him go. There's a parallel passage that explains verse number 23. You took him, but you delivered him, or you put him into the hands of Pilate. You denied him before Pilate, and then Pilate crucified him or oversaw the crucifixion of him. And the idea here of men, wicked men, is the idea of lawless men, or perhaps even men not under the law, not under the law of Moses. You delivered him to men who weren't even under the law that you were under, and they crucified him. And so this was God's fixed plan. God always knew that he would die. It didn't take him by surprise. This rejection of Israel, of their Messiah in Jesus coming into the world, wasn't something God didn't foreknow. He foreknew it, and he even spoke to it in the Old Testament, as we'll get to that prophecy within our discussion. And then you understand God raised him up. Verse number 24, whom God hath raised up, having loosed the pains of death, because it was not possible that he should be holden of it. God raised him. The pains of death here is literally birth pangs. He is using an analogy of a woman in child labor, or in labor in childbirth, and the pains that would come upon that travailing pain. And he speaks of it in terms of the travail of death being like that, but coming to an end. Think about that means of childbirth, the immense pain that would come with it. And of course, Peter's talking about this prior to epidurals and prior to other things that may make it a little easier, a little less painful. But the pangs of death being literally the birth pangs, the idea of Jesus being under those pangs of death would be loosed, and he would come forth, and just like that labor setting in and that pain being upon the woman, it was not going to stop death or stop the birth of that child. It would actually initiate the birthing process, and then of course, once the birthing process was complete, the pangs of birth are set aside, and now the joy of that baby being placed within the arms of the mother is experienced. And so Jesus would be kept in the pangs of death, but for a time, and he would not be holden of it. He would not be corded. The cords of death are used in the Old Testament. He would not be so held in that chamber of death, but rather he would issue forth. He would come forth, and the joy would offset the pangs. Remember what Hebrews chapter 11, or chapter 12 rather, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, knowing the outcome, or the other side, he was willing to endure the pangs of death. He was not holden of it, but he came forth from the grave for the joy that would produce, or the resulting joy of his death and his subsequent resurrection. And so while you condemned him, God approved him. While you put him to death, God raised him. Now, at this point, realize three things. Number one, this is the gospel in 3 verses. The life, the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus, all wrapped up in that short synopsis to the Israelites. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul said he declared the gospel. How Jesus died according to the Scriptures, he was buried according to the Scriptures, and he rose again the third day according to the Scriptures. Peter wraps all of that up in these 3 verses. The Scriptures relate the facts as to why that is good news. Remember, that's the gospel. The word gospel means good news. Why is it good news that Jesus lived, died, was buried, and resurrected the third day? Well, it goes on to explain in the Scripture the price of redemption being paid. And when we conform to the image of his death, Romans chapter 6, being buried with him in baptism, so as like as Christ was raised up from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life. We understand the good news of the gospel in that Jesus died, paying the price for sin. He shed his blood to cleanse us from iniquity. We are baptized into his death, and as he raised forth, we come up out of that watery grave being free or being set free from that sin that his blood paid the redemptive price for. That's why that gospel is such good news. And so Peter presents the gospel unto them in these first three verses. The reason that they would need to call upon the name of the Lord first and foremost is because he died, he lived, approved of God, accredited by God by his miracles, and he died and was resurrected. Because of that gospel, they need to call upon him. That's number one. Now, they knew of the miracles. They knew even of the crucifixion. He says, even as ye yourselves also know, in verse number 22. And it had been less than a month and a half since the crucifixion had taken place. So all of that knowledge of the crucifixion was still fresh. So they knew of his miracles. They knew of his crucifixion. Remember, he's also talking to Israelites who knew the law. So in the next part of his sermon, he's going to answer the troubling part regarding the resurrection as to the prophetic knowledge of the Old Testament that presented the fact of resurrection. Now, remember this. He's just told them that Jesus raised from the dead. They knew of his miracles. They knew of his crucifixion. But when it comes to this resurrection part, and even the crucifixion part, connecting that with the Messiah is troubling to the Israelite, because number one, it didn't fit their expectation of the Messiah. One who would actually die, who would succumb to death, who would be subject to rejection and death. And then number two, when you connect Deuteronomy 21 in verse number 23 and Galatians 3:13 to the subject matter, the idea that the law pronounced a curse upon any man who died upon a tree, well, Jesus died on a tree. And how could it be that this cursed individual, the one that the law would pronounce a curse upon, would be the Messiah? And Peter's got to help them with that. So the next part of his sermon is going to build on that resurrection. And Peter is now going to show that prophecy had foretold that this resurrection would take place as part of God's determinate counsel and foreknowledge. And it's the fulfillment of prophecy. Look at verse number 25. He says, for David speaketh concerning him, I foresaw the Lord always before my face. He is on my right hand that I should not be moved. Therefore did my heart rejoice, my tongue was glad. Moreover, my flesh shall rest in hope, because thou wilt not leave my soul in hell, neither wilt thou suffer thine Holy One to see corruption. Thou hast made known to me the ways of life. Thou shalt make me full of joy with thy countenance. Now, these are words that David had spoken. Go back to Psalm 16, in verse 8. That's who he's quoting. And while David may have appeared to be talking about himself, Peter says he couldn't have been. And he's going to explain with three reasons why David was talking about Jesus and the resurrection and not talking about himself. In verse number 29, he says, men and brethren, let me freely speak of the patriarch David. Patriarch in the sense that he is the beginning of that royal line. And now he says, here's three reasons why what David said in Psalm 16 is a reference not to himself, but a reference to Jesus and his resurrection. First of all, David is dead, he is buried, and his sepulcher is with us unto this day. In Nehemiah chapter 3 and verse 16, when they were rebuilding the wall, it mentions one by the name of Nehemiah, not Nehemiah who is leading as governor the rebuilding of the wall, but another Nehemiah that is responsible for a certain section of the wall. His section of the wall is going to proceed at its beginning point all the way to the sepulcher of David. Even after the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, the temple had been utterly destroyed, but the sepulcher of David was still there. And now we come some 400 plus years later, some 450 years later, and Peter mentions the sepulcher of David still right there in the city of Jerusalem. It was evident, it was there, it was present. In fact, as far as recorded knowledge is, David and his line, his son, like Solomon, were the only ones whose sepulcher was actually within the walls of the city. And the fact that his sepulcher was right there was an indication that David's body saw corruption. So he couldn't have been talking about himself, because David was talking about someone whose body would not see corruption. But the fact that his tomb was there indicated that his body did see corruption, because it had been there for over 1,000 years. Number 2, he says he was a prophet. Therefore, being a prophet, and knowing that God hath sworn with an oath to him. David being a prophet. The idea of being a prophet is that he existed as a prophet. David was a mouthpiece of God, and thus, in his speaking, he could speak of messianic future. He could talk about things that would come to pass. He could predict future events as a prophet. And so his statements were predictive of the Messiah. Number 1, David's still in the tomb. His body saw corruption, so he couldn't have been talking about himself. Number 2, he was a prophet, so he could be talking about the Messiah. He could foretell future events. But number 3, the reason he was the one who foretold of this future event is because God had made an oath to him. Verse number 30, God had sworn with an oath to him that of the fruit of his loins, according to the flesh, he would raise up Christ to sit on his throne. God has sworn with an oath, 2 Samuel 7, verse 12 through 16. Nathan was the prophet who first told David that. David actually speaks of it in Psalm 89, verse 3 and 4, and Psalm 132 and verse 11, which are probably the verses that Peter is paraphrasing here. Peter is probably referencing those passages in Psalms, but the initial prophecy regarded David's seed after him being raised to sit on his throne for an everlasting period, which wouldn't have been a reference to David who would die or Solomon who would die, but somebody else. In order for that to happen, the promise to David could only be fulfilled if death was overcome in resurrection. And David understood this in the prophecy, or spoke to this in the prophecy, that the flesh would not see corruption, meaning it wouldn't stay in the grave so as to deteriorate, decay, and return unto the dust, as the spirit returned to God who gave it, Ecclesiastes 12:7, but rather would be raised up. If he was going to sit on an everlasting throne, it would require that in coming in the flesh, being subject to death, he would have to be raised. And remember, Hebrews chapter 2, with verse number 14 beginning, he took on the form of his brethren, flesh and blood, so that he could taste of death or understand death and be a participant in death so as to overcome death and thus have to be resurrected. So David, he prophesied of this resurrection of the Messiah because he wasn't talking of himself. He, being a prophet, could talk of the future events. And number 3, he talked of his seed that would be established upon his throne after having been raised up. So he alludes to that. Now, the question that now had to be answered is, to what end would he be resurrected? And in verse number 33 through verse 36, as he talks about the outcome or the results of that resurrection, now you have it in verse 33 through verse number 36. Now, just might mention this. In verse number 32, he references himself and the other apostles again as witnesses. We'll not talk about the true type of witness that they were. We talked about that with chapter 1. But again, we have this assertion that to be a witness of Jesus, you actually had to see him alive after his resurrection. So if you talk about witnessing for Jesus today, you cannot. Thus, it's an impractical term. It's not a scriptural aspect or a scriptural meaning. It is not a scriptural term as far as witnessing for Christ, because these witnesses were witnesses to his resurrection and also his earthly life, those signs, miracles, and wonders which he did, by which God approved or accredited him. And so he says, we are witnesses. So you have the witness of prophecy, but you have this right now. And then he says, therefore, being by the right hand of God exalted, and having received of the Father the promise of the Holy Ghost, he has shed forth this which ye now see and hear. For David is not ascended to the heavens, but he saith himself, the Lord said unto my Lord, sit thou on my right hand until I make thy foes thy footstool. The consequence of the resurrection. Number one, Jesus was raised by God to an exalted position. So again, look at that. Being by the right hand of God exalted. The word by there is a preposition that speaks to the instrumentality. He was raised by the power of God to be exalted. Philippians chapter 2 talks about being exalted by God, that at the name of Christ every tongue should confess and every knee should bow. A reference to his authority. The authority of Christ demands that we confess him and that we bow or submit ourselves to him. And so, therefore, being by the right hand of God exalted, it is by God's power, the right hand being a symbol of power, by the power of God, he was exalted in that resurrection. So why was he raised? Number one, to exalt him, to lift him up, to put him in that exalted position. Number two, in order to receive the promise of the Father. Remember in John 16 and verse 7, he said he had to depart and go to the Father, otherwise he couldn't send the Comforter. So if he goes to the Father, he would be able to send the Comforter. Well, he was resurrected and ascended back to the Father in order to fulfill or to send forth that promise, which is what has happened right before them. The fact that they are seeing this before them now, this manifestation, the outpouring of the Spirit, the speaking in tongues by the apostles, these mighty things that they are witnessing, these miraculous signs that are taking place right then, he had to ascend to the Father, being resurrected from the grave, in order for that to happen. And the fact that it is happening shows that he is positioned at the right hand of God. And the third thing he mentions there is the prophecy of David. So he is raised to be in that exalted position. He is raised to send that promise of the Father. But then there is conclusive demonstration through the prophecy of David. Because in Psalm 110 and verse 1, and David is quoted by Jesus in Matthew 22. This is probably among the most well-known passages and maybe one of the most quoted in the New Testament, where he says, the Lord said unto my Lord, sit thou on my right hand. Now David is saying that. Who is David's Lord? To whom the Lord said to him, sit on my right hand. Because he wasn't talking to David. Whoever he was speaking to was David's Lord. And that would be the Messiah, the seed of David, who would be raised to that exalted position. Sit on my right hand. And so the consequence of the resurrection from the dead is that he was raised to exaltation. He was able to send forth the promise of the Father. And to that, David had readily testified by way of prophecy that Jesus would resurrect, or he would be raised and set at the Father's right hand. Thus, the resurrection to that exalted position, he is both Lord and Christ. Notice the grand conclusion. Therefore, let all the house of Israel know assuredly that God hath made this same Jesus, again whom ye have crucified, both Lord and Christ. And thus the conclusion, the evidence is in, the verdict is pronounced. The reason you need to call upon the name of the Lord is because God has approved of him. It was God's determinate counsel and foreknowledge that these things occur. It was the prophecy of God going forward that signified or told you that he would raise from the dead, and upon that resurrection, he would ascend to take his position upon the throne as both Lord and Christ. And thus, you need to appeal to his authority for salvation. No longer to the law of Moses, but rather to the authority of Jesus. Now, I know it's taken us a little while to get there, and we still have a lot to go in Acts chapter 2, because now we know what needs to happen. Call upon the name of the Lord to be saved, and now we know why that needs to happen according to the words of Peter, because Jesus is sitting at the right hand of God, both Lord and Christ. Why does he have that authority? Well, Peter has answered that. And now that he is sitting there, you need to submit to his authority. Now, after the question is asked by the people, what shall we do? He is going to tell them how to submit to that authority. We don't have time to get into that today. We'll do that in next week's Bible study. But up to this point, as we close out the day, I want to assert to you, I want you to see as we've gone through that Jesus currently reigns at the right hand of God. He is currently upon his throne. Don't look for a throne upon the earthly city of Jerusalem. Peter said he is now reigning over his kingdom. And now that he is sitting upon that throne, he is both Lord and Christ. He is to be the governance of your life. You need to appeal to his authority. And the great question as we end the session today is for you to inquire of your own life, are you submitting to him as both Lord and Christ? Now remember, next week we'll get into more specifically how that submission is done. But clearly you and I need to ask the question too, what must we do in order to be saved? Because he is the one who has the authority to save us. And he is going to declare through his apostles what needs to be done to be saved. And so stay tuned next week. We'll get into it. You can go ahead and read ahead in chapter 2. But know this, whatever Peter presents here is going to be the answer for all time. As long as Jesus sits upon his throne, it will be the answer to the question, what do I do in order to be saved? It will be the answer to the question, what does it mean to call upon the name of the Lord? And we'll further that discussion next week. May God bless you as you continue to study with us.